So I think the EU is truly, they've lost the plot. Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, he is a leading British historian, analyst, and author specialising in Russia and the former Soviet Union. Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, thanks for joining us. I have to ask you this, in your humble opinion, how ignorant would Lindsey Graham be?
Lindsey Graham knows nothing about the history of Russia, the history of Ukraine. He also knows nothing about military affairs. Lindsey Graham is merely a representative of the American deep state, or put more simply, a useful idiot of the American deep state. And ideally, people like Lindsey Graham should be quarantined forever. I do not believe that people who promote war, who promote murder, who promote the violation of the most fundamental elements of human life should be allowed to roam our streets, should be allowed to roam our towns and cities. They should not be rehabilitated. As I said, people like Lindsey Graham should be in prison for the rest of their lives, along with, of course, the likes of Bill Clinton, George Bush Jr., Barack Obama, and Biden, and so on and so on.
Yeah, but the question is, who's going to play mother in jail? Because they all deserve to be in jail.
Well, there should be no one playing mother in jail. As I said, their rehabilitation should be applied to people who have made minor deviations in their lives. For example, they have stolen a car. These people should be rehabilitated, and they can be rehabilitated. But people who have blood on their hands, for example, war criminals such as Tony Blair, or again, Lindsey Graham, or rapists or paedophiles, they should be put in prison forever. And when I say prison, I mean a Victorian style prison. That is how you deal with people like that. That is how you safeguard Western civilization. And that is how you safeguard the safety of men, women, and children, especially women and children.
Um, Despite the talk on sanctions and weapons, has the great Donald Trump run out of options?
The war in Ukraine is the war of the Western ruling elites. In America today, there is a struggle for power between, on the one hand, Trump and his administration, and on the other hand, the American deep state. The American deep state remains entrenched in power. It ultimately controls organs such as the CIA and the military. Now, unless you are at the heart of that struggle, you will not truly understand what is going on. But suffice to say, there is a struggle for power. Donald Trump does not favor war. I believe he does not favor war on the basis of morality, but also he believes war is a waste of money. Therefore, the war in Ukraine is certainly not his war. It is the American deep state's war.
Mm.
And this war will only be decided on the battlefield. Whilst I applaud Trump's attempts to bring about a peaceful solution to the war in Ukraine, the reality is that he will not be successful. And so, again, the war, as I have said from day one in February of 2022, this war will be decided on the battlefield, and the result will be a victory for Russia. And that will mean, in practice, that either the whole of Ukraine or most of Ukraine will be captured by the Russian army and will be absorbed into the Russian Federation.
Yeah, when it got fairly ugly after Ukraine fired a whole bunch of missiles into Russia and they said, got to stop that, we don't want it anymore, they had about 30 days left of food. Ukraine they were gone. So when people say that Russia is taking over Europe, I mean, they didn't want to get involved in this stoush with Ukraine stroke NATO. They didn't want that at all. But the other side did, didn't they? You had NATO and well, not Ukraine, NATO, and Europe wanted to show Putin that how dare he think he can be so big and powerful, and it's sort of come back and bitten them. If you look at the governments, they're suggesting that they all take out a loan, go into debt, and then give it to Zelensky. What could possibly go wrong, Marcus?
First of all, Russia has no interest in countries such as Poland or Hungary or Slovakia or France or Germany or Britain. Russia has an interest in Ukraine. And ever since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December of 1991, which I must add was against the wishes of the vast majority of the people of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Russia has been keeping a very close eye on Ukraine, because ever since Ukraine became independent at the end of 1991, the American ruling elite, or the American deep state, has lusted after Ukraine, understanding that without Ukraine, Russia can never wield the influence and power which it did during the Soviet period. Furthermore, a Ukraine in the West's sphere of influence, in particular, a Ukraine in NATO, would result in Russia being encircled on its western borders, which would be catastrophic for Russian national security because it would threaten the Russian strategic nuclear deterrent. So yes, Russia does have a very strong interest in Ukraine from a national security perspective and also from a cultural perspective. Kiev, after all, is the mother of all Russian cities. That is not Putin propaganda. That is not Russian propaganda. I suggest people go in Western countries such as London, they go to the National Archives and have a look at Foreign Office documents in the 19th century, because British diplomats say quite clearly that Kiev is the mother of all Russian cities. There is no reference to a Ukrainian nation. So that is why there is a war today in Ukraine. It is because the Western ruling elites are attempting to enclose Russia on its western border. And Russia will never tolerate that. And when I say Russia, I don't just mean the Kremlin, I mean the ordinary Russian man and Russian woman.
Yeah, we've got something like Russia or some foreign country deciding to plonk a few missiles on the border of Mexico. I'm sure the US, and rightly so, wouldn't like that either. If they have this problem with taking out a loan, basically, and they are legitimately, they're going to do this, and save Ukraine, which is just hogwash. But if they are going to do that, wouldn't the European economy just collapse?
I believe, Mike, that if there was a revolution in Britain, if there was revolutions across the European continent, continental Europe, I believe that once the books are open, you would see that the British economy and the economies on mainland Europe are either bankrupt or close to bankruptcy. The Western ruling elites are printing vast amounts of money. They are taking vast amounts of loans out, and they are sending much of this money to Zelensky and his henchmen. Why? Well, firstly, they are attempting to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia, because for them, Russia is the ultimate enemy, not just because Russia is the only country in the world that can literally destroy them, because Russia is a military and nuclear superpower, but also because Russia stands in the way of the Western ruling elites' woke ideology. Russia defends religion. Russia defends culture. Russia defends traditional family values. Russia defends the identity and rights of women. Russia defends the safety of children. Russia is opposed to mass immigration. Russia is opposed to open borders. So that is why they are sending vast amounts of British taxpayers' money, American taxpayers' money, German taxpayers' money, and so on to Ukraine. This has nothing to do with democracy. This has nothing to do with freedom. And quite frankly, Mike, anyone who believes that the Western ruling elites believe in democracy, believe in freedom, quite frankly, don't even have an ounce of brain cells.
I think you're being very kind, actually. You mentioned before revolution, and I've been saying fairly quietly, although not so quietly of late, that the world really is in need of a revolution. And you would think a peaceful one, but peaceful ones end up being a peace march. And so I think a revolution, I mean, it's a nice way of cleaning the swamp out, isn't it? Do you think, though, it will happen? Do you think there will be a revolution, or do you think that that generally the populace has drunk their Kool-Aid and are just bobbing along, not terribly concerned about anything? Or do you think there actually will be the underswell of discontent and a revolution, not just in the UK, but globally? Look at Europe. Should be a revolution there. Get rid of the elite there. Same thing in the UK. Look at Ireland. It's a complete basket case. Look at the US. Even though a lot of it's not Donald Trump's fault entirely, he's the skipper. He's the guy at the helm of the ship, so he has to take responsibility. I believe that the only way for change to happen, great change to happen, is to have that revolution.
I agree, Mike. Nothing short of a revolution can save the Western world, Western civilization, and the ancient nations of the Western world. It is abundantly clear that over many decades now, the Western ruling elites have inflicted colossal damage on the cultural and spiritual values of Western nations. They have inflicted tremendous damage on the ability of the average person in the Western world to think independently, to think critically, and to think rationally. So the situation in the Western world, be it Britain, continental Europe, America, Australia, and so on, is extremely grave. And I believe it is the greatest threat ever posed to Western civilization. It is a different kind of threat. It is an insidious threat. That all said, Mike, ever since the pandemic, there has been a great awakening throughout the Western world. The average person, for example, in Britain, now understands the people who rule, not govern, who rule Britain, hate the British people, hate the cultural and spiritual values of the British people, and hate the history of the British people. They also understand that British mainstream media is neither free nor independent. It is simply propaganda aimed against the British people. And we are seeing this in countries such as Australia, New Zealand, and America, and Canada. So that is something to rejoice over. There is a cultural and spiritual awakening in the Western world. We should also be mindful that history teaches us that all is impermanent. The situation in the Western world at present is horrific, absolutely diabolical. And I use the word diabolical in a biblical sense, but I do not believe that it will be permanent. I do believe that the regimes in the Western world, the Western ruling elites, will fall from power. They have pushed Western nations to the breaking point. And we all know that every human being, even a placid human being, has a breaking point. The Western ruling elites have flooded the Western world with immigrants from outside of the Western world. And the consequences have been catastrophic and inevitable. And there is a growing backlash. There is a great awareness. There is a great awakening. There is a lot more to do. But again, I agree with you. Only a revolution can save the Western world. I believe it will happen. Will it happen in our lifetimes? I sincerely hope so. But again, history teaches us that all is impermanent. Who thought the Austro-Hungarian Empire would collapse? Who thought the Ottomans would collapse? Who thought Tsarist Russia would collapse? It can happen. The question is when.
Your expertise is also as a historian. Do you think, because if you look around, it's the leaders of our free world, Macron, Starmer, Trump, who else is Albanese in Australia, heaven help us. Do you think their lack of, they're just ignorant oafs? Because if they had studied histories, like with climate change, if you study, a geologist studies history with the rocks, and you can tell what has happened and what's going to happen because things become as they are, cyclic. Do you think, though, all this posturing in chest out and we're going to do this to the evil Russians and do that to those terrible Chinese and blah, 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 if they studied history, do you think we would be in this position now?
The focus should not be on the likes of Macron or Starmer. The people who are prime ministers or presidents in the Western world, aside from Trump, are puppets of the Western ruling elites. They are useful idiots. They hold no power whatsoever. They have been put in these positions because there is nothing they won't do for money, status, etc., etc. They are utterly unintelligent. They are soulless. They are dead human beings. That is why they are in those positions. They carry out the instructions of the Western ruling elites. At the heart of the Western ruling elites are, for example, European monarchies, European aristocracies, banking elites, financial elites, media barons, to name but a few. These are the people at the heart. No different to when someone in Britain complains to me about Sadiq Khan. Sadiq Khan is a puppet. He's a useful idiot. If the day comes when he is no longer mayor, the British ruling elite, of which the British royal family is at the heart of, will simply find a replacement. Now, I'm not saying that in the aftermath of a revolution, the useful idiots should not stand trial in a court of law. Of course they should. But they are puppets. We have to identify who is ruling the Western world. So it follows, therefore, that the likes of Starmer and Macron, who literally came from nowhere in politics, and then a few years later, they become prime minister or president, they know nothing about history. But they don't need to know anything about history. That is not why they are there. They are there simply to fulfill the instructions of their masters. And if they fail to do that, then they are replaced either through a scandal or something similar.
Tell me, how does the complexity of the Ukraine NATO thing Russia, of course, how does it change now that Zelensky's done a deal with the US on rare earth minerals?
The minerals agreement between Washington and Kiev amounts to nothing in practice. The Russian army, as we talk, Mike, is advancing on all fronts. The Russian army is advancing in the Sumy Oblast, in the Kharkov Oblast. It has virtually captured the whole of Lugansk Oblast. It is advancing the Donetsk Oblast. It is advancing in Zaporozhye Oblast and the Kherson Oblast. It is also poised to enter the oblast of Dnipropetrovsk. And as the Russian army is advancing, it is capturing minerals, such as various minerals, which have been given to the Americans. So this minerals agreement amounts to nothing in practice. Russia has been winning this war from day one. Has the Russian military incurred setbacks? Yes, they have, but not major setbacks, not setbacks which will alter the eventual outcome of the war. Russia can call up 23 million soldiers if need be. Russia has over 26,000 tanks, either active or in storage. When Western mainstream media says that the Kremlin claimed its army would be in Kiev in 3 days, that is a lie. Mark Milley, the American general, was the one who said the Russian army would arrive in Kiev after 3 days. Furthermore, the reason why North Korean soldiers were fighting in the Kursk Oblast is not because Russia is short of soldiers. It is because there is a strategic military defense agreement between Russia and North Korea. And because of that, the North Koreans wanted their military to have battlefield experience. The North Korean military has not fought a war since the Korean Civil War. Therefore, for the North Korean leadership, it is imperative that its soldiers have battlefield experience. That is why North Korean soldiers were fighting in Kursk. And as I said at the beginning of this interview, I believe the Russian army will advance all the way to and capture the oblasts of Vinnytsia and Zhytomyr. From there, I don't know if the Russians will advance into what is known as Eastern Galicia, because in Eastern Galicia, you find fierce anti-Russian sentiment, because there is a lot of Polish, Lithuanian, and Austrian blood there. Much of the population there is Catholic, very different to the rest of Ukraine. So will the Russian army advance into Eastern Galicia? I do not know. Will the Russian army advance to and capture the oblasts of Vinnytsia and Zhytomyr and therefore take 70% at least of Ukraine? Absolutely. Now that the Russian army is in Ukraine, nothing can dislodge it.
We hear that. I mean, we get all sorts of figures from the Palestinian genocide, and we hear of great losses in Western media from the Russians, and that Ukraine is just an amazing fighting force. What are the real figures with Russia and Ukraine in losses? And I would imagine that it really it's very top heavy on the Ukraine side, which is not at any stage are we saying good on Russia. It's a very sad and very distressing that these young men are dying fighting for a cause they don't believe in. So what sort of numbers do we have at the moment?
Let me say, first of all, that the overall capacity of the Russian military, and remember, the Russian military is a superpower, the overall amount which the Russian military is designating to the war in Ukraine, I estimate, ranges between 12 and 15%, which is very little. And yet, look at the colossal casualties which the Russian military has inflicted, not just on NATO's Ukrainian army, but also on NATO's stockpiles. NATO's stockpiles are extremely low, and in some cases, they are depleted. That is something that Trump is acutely aware of. As regards the losses on both sides in this war, which could have been avoided, but wasn't.
Yep.
It is impossible for me to say, but it is very clear that there is a very serious shortage of manpower in Ukraine. I believe that Ukrainian losses overall, killed in action, injured, missing in action, taken prisoner, are well in excess of 1 million. As regards Russian losses, again, that is very difficult to say, but I would estimate that killed in action, missing in action, and wounded, and prisoners, though there's not many Russian prisoners in Ukrainian camps, I would say over 100,000. And that is a figure that many independent military analysts, and I mean true military analysts, have put forward. All in all, it is a dreadful loss in life. But as I said, this war could have been avoided. Over 20 years ago, I was warning on television, on radio, in speeches, and in articles that there will be a war in Ukraine because of the endeavors of NATO, of the Western ruling elite, ultimately. But no one even knew where Ukraine was at that time. And here we are, a dreadful major war. And unfortunately, this war will only be decided on the battlefield.
What would save that I won't say final conflict, but actually it would be the final conflict in that part of Europe. But what would save all this? What if there was something to be done to stop it all now? What would have to be done?
Revolutions throughout the Western world. The Western world is occupied by forces which hate the Western world, as I described earlier on in this interview. Unless the Western ruling elites fall from power, including in America, because Donald Trump is not at the helm of the ship. He is not. There is a struggle for power. Unless the Western ruling elites fall from power, then this war will continue, not indefinitely, but the bloodshed will continue. If the Western ruling elites were to fall from power through popular uprisings, and we can see clearly, for example, in continental Europe, that there is a mass awakening. People are now coming to their senses. People now understand the threat to their countries. If that was to happen, if patriots or nationalists were to come to power throughout continental Europe, then yes, this war would come to an end. But the whole of the Western world would need to be liberated. It's no good just continental Europe, Britain, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Anglo-Saxon world. And I use the term Anglo-Saxon in a positive way. I'm part English. I'm very proud to be Anglo-Saxon. I'm very proud of the achievements in Australia and New Zealand. But Australia, New Zealand, Britain, Canada, and America are ruled by people who hate everything about the Western identity, everything about Anglo-Saxon identity, Anglo-Celtic identity. Just look at the steps they have taken to erode the Western national identity. So I reiterate, if you want this war, if this war in Ukraine is to come to an end, the Western ruling elites cannot remain in power because they are the ones who started this war. They are the ones who are fueling this war. It is not in the interests of the average Australian or the average German or the average Briton. If it is, then the Western ruling elites need to provide empirically based evidence to support it. There's no point saying, well, Russia went into Ukraine. Well, history shows us that provocations on a country's borders can instigate war. War is not black and white. And quite frankly, people who destroy a country's national identity, who destroy a people's cultural and spiritual values, constitute the enemy.
Yeah, I think you're right about the Australia and New Zealand. When in fact Australia sent over its armoured personnel vehicles or carriers. They're called what are they called? The Bushmaster. And you, because you're a Brit, you understand that the Bushmaster is very much like the Hillman Imp. And that was a dreadful car. So that's the reason so much for us. We thought, how do we get rid of our Bushmasters? We'll send it to Ukraine. And they all broke down, of course. If there is this final conflict, and because for a revolution to happen, we need all to be on the same page. We all need to be able to communicate with each other, blah, 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 blah. As the governments get this stranglehold on inverted commas free speech or right of movement or blah, 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 because of increases in security measures such as biometrics and digital ID and da-da-da-da, it would show you that we only have a short, maybe a year or 18 months to enact anything to bring upon change that is good for Europe and the world. How long do you think we have? I mean, I think looking at biometrics with Donald Trump, RFK Jr. said every American will be wearing a wearable within 4 years, for your own health, of course, but they can track you where you go, what you're doing, who you're talking to. So the opportunities to create a revolution is diminishing, I would see, very quickly.
We have up until 2030. That is the date that the Western ruling elites have set themselves to utterly destroy the old Western world and to introduce a new way of life, which quite frankly would be a demonic way of life. And again, I truly mean demonic way of life. So time is of the essence. Furthermore, history provides us with numerous examples of where revolutions have occurred legally and peacefully. And that is what I urge: legal and peaceful measures. Further to that, it is absolutely essential that every Western nation returns to their culture, returns to their religion, which of course is Christianity. We would not be in this mess today, Mike, if people had not turned their backs on Christianity, which is the fundamental pillar of Western civilization. And Christianity is not what, for example, the Church of England has been teaching for many years now. God and Jesus are not forgiving. There is a hell. So ignore what the Church of England says. The Church of England is not a proper church. The Church of England, as well as its head, the monarch, has never expressed sadness, regret at the decline of Christianity in Britain. So the Western nations must return to their roots. If they don't return to their roots, if they don't find their national identity, if they don't restore their national identity, then there can be no change in the Western world. It is imperative. It is non-negotiable. The fundamental pillar of Western civilization is Christianity. The cultures of the Western nations are second to that. Without that, there can be no Western world, there can be no Western civilization, and there can be no future for the Western world, for the Western nations. A people with no culture is a people with no future.
Well said, brilliant. Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, analyst, and author. Just quickly, if somebody wants to find out more about what you're doing or what you're thinking, how do they do that?
I'm on various social media platforms. I am on YouTube, I am on Odyssey, I am on Rumble, X, Facebook. I'm also on Gab and Getter, but alas, they have been banned in the ever so democratic loving United Kingdom. I also have two books, Arise Rossiya and Whitehall in Stalin's Russia, both of which can be bought on various platforms, including, I regret, Amazon, but I have no choice but to list those books on a platform which I do not like. But as I said, in order to get the message out, sometimes you have to, so to speak, bite the bullet in life.
Well, we have to at times. We've got to take it on the chin, do it for king and country, something like that.
Do it for country. Do it for country.
That's right. I just as a footnote here, I did the edit when you had a chat to Paladin Taylor, and I'm a very quick editor, but I sometimes forget where I am, what I'm doing. I end up watching the whole interview, so it goes forever. And after you had finished talking with Pella, I thought to myself, I actually have to have an opportunity to talk to you because I think you are simply a magnificent person, sir, and I'm very grateful. Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, analyst, and author, thank you very much. This is The Pulse.